It's gone sick. And I don't like the term woke because I hear woke, woke, woke. You know, it's like just a term that use half the people can't even define it. They don't know what it is.
Yes, folks. David here, Left Reckoning 121, the end of left populism, and Erdogan holds on. Joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David. Good to be with you.
Happy you made it. We got a fun-ass show for everybody tonight. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Alex Hochuli, author of The End of History, and also one of the hosts of BungaCast, which is a personal favorite show of mine. And later in the show, we're going to be joined by our good buddy and friend, Mr. Djene Bajalan. Djene's going to be talking with us about the recent elections in Turkey. He's also be sticking around for us in the post game, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to that. Talking about a few things, including this new Cornel West bid for the presidency of the United States. Really looking forward to having him on for that.
Yeah, very exciting stuff. Another candidate enters the ring.
I know. You know, that's a good thing. You know, you thought might be another boring election, but I think will at least be enough to talk about. So really looking forward to that and hearing all of y'all's thoughts. Also, I think Chip Gibbons is going to join me this Thursday for a Griscom stream. We're going to be talking about Edward Snowden. So make sure you check that out. I think around 3 Central on Thursday. But without and also wait, what did we do for our bonus episode last week? We had a really nice one. I should remind people about that.
Why am I
Canada? We went up north.
Well, Canada, Jeremy Appel. We talked Alberta, and some actual. Speaking of populism, it is continuing to basically, back progressive liberalism into the paint and then dunk on it. In at least the Alberta elections, we talk about just transition stuff. Jeremy's really a keen viewer of Albertan politics. It's fun to talk to him.
Oh yeah. Well, before we get Alex on, we're going to be talking about left populism, sort of where we're at in the movement right now. Really looking forward to that. Matt, do you think you could give folks an update on what's been happening in Atlanta?
Yeah, so there was a city council vote, one that I don't think, I would have been nice if the city council surprised us and voted against funding Cop City, but the cops and people seemed to kind of telegraphed that wasn't going to be the case. Intercept has a new article here. It's interesting to note that of the four. So, well, first let's go about public comment. A lot of people have been seeing these images of the people waiting in line to speak their voice about what they have to say about this. Not really content with maybe how they were expecting the city council to vote on this. And here's this guy. And I think this way, look, we have all sorts of reasons for understanding why investments in more policing and like counterinsurgency domestically, basically, isn't exactly what this country needs, or is the exact opposite to what this country needs to be doing with its public funds. But I think the way this guy puts it in terms of I'll let him say this and then we'll comment on it.
I live in Southwest Atlanta in District 10 with my wife and daughter. Both my wife and I grew up here. Our families call Atlanta home, and we are deeply rooted and invested in this city and its future. I've never spoken at council before, but I've been so disturbed by how the city has ignored the voices of its constituents, lied about how much money is going to this facility, violently suppressed its own residents for protesting and organizing to stop the destruction of Woolani Forest, just so that the police can build a new training center that we don't need, that we don't want. I knew I had to be here today. I have a little girl. She's about to turn 2. She's the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. I never knew I could love someone so much. On our way to daycare in the morning, we sing songs as I try to avoid the potholes that have been there for years. I drive by neighbors waiting at bus stops with no benches, no shelters from the rain. We see unhoused neighbors and community members sleeping under makeshift shelters. And we see cop cars cruising our neighborhood all day, every day. I've been harassed on more than one occasion by the cops in my neighborhood. They make me feel the opposite of safe. Spending $60 million taxpayer dollars on a new police training facility is the most heartbreaking, reckless, and quite frankly, anti-black thing this city has ever proposed in my lifetime. I cannot I cannot believe I'm standing here pleading for you to not spend the tax dollars of a black city to tear down a forest in a black neighborhood, to increase the policing and caging of more and more black people, all this in a city with black leadership. I'm tired of it. Just think of what $60 million can do to care, educate, house, and nurture the people of the city, the children of the city. Say no to Cop City. Thank you.
And I think that the message it sends, what you're doing with these investments, right? Like, is really, I don't know how much further you need to go than that. Because I mean, I remember growing up in Bismarck, we were getting a nice big community center with a football field. That felt awesome. And like the one thing, and like, I mean, it's just, and so like, okay, so overwhelmingly, the city council, I believe it was 13-4, somewhere around there, 4 votes against the funding. The intercept piece goes into the where those go, but not surprisingly, especially the district most closest to it would be Atlanta's 5th district, most vocal in opposition to this. All 4 of those no votes were from elected folks, folks elected in 2021, which is interesting. And this is in the, and so we have a couple groups here. We have the Chris Carr, the Georgia Attorney General, who is obviously like and the sort of non-Atlanta Republicans want to use this as a way to stick it to Antifa, obviously, right? And you obviously have the genuine anarchist, Antifa, but forest defender type folks who are putting their neck on the line. Literally, one of them has been killed by cops during this. But I think also you have one, as mentioned, these districts which are closest to the neighborhood are the ones most in opposition. And right now the city council's like, yeah, well, that's too diffuse. So you know what? So what? We got all these other districts which are far away from it. They don't seem to be as animated as you are. And like I think we mentioned on a previous episode here, it should have been, you have something like this that's getting this contentious, you put that to a wide referendum, as opposed to this sort of, I mean, this is what this sort of, I guess, politics is for. The way this was designed this way is to make that, diffuse that energy across the electorate that isn't quite so animated.
Yeah, and like, just to remind folks, we've done a few segments on this that go into more in depth. What was finally agreed to by the city council is almost double what was originally proposed. The city council sort of made it seem like, oh no, we've always been honest about how much money this was going to be. You just didn't read the plan properly, which in my opinion is absolutely bogus. And it's just, I mean, it's an incredible amount of money. About I believe something like 60 million of that is direct taxpayer. The rest of it is coming from massive corporations. Remember when we had Jamie Peck on the show? One of the things that's really notable about it is, remember, Atlanta makes a lot of movies and TV now. One of the stipulations is that the movie studios, the local movie and TV studios, will be able to use Cop City to make good cop movies in the near future, right? So there's a lot of, like, on top of the fact of like the way the Republicans are trying to utilize this for their statewide and national ambitions, there's just a lot of like capitalist forces that have been engaged in this process from the very beginning, and clearly, and we've played a lot of the conversations that have happened in city council and with other elected officials and the public. It's very clear that the public, I mean, the local politicians have very little interest in hearing from the community. Remember, like, this is like really important, that 8 of the yes votes for funding Cop City were Democrats. Now, Atlanta, just for people who don't know, like, it's one of those non-official partisan states, but these people run, and it's very clear which political party they're affiliated with, right? And it's just, it shows how dangerous to this kind of like Biden, post-Biden philosophy of like how we're going to change Southern politics is, because the Democratic Party in those cities is very, very willing to turn their backs on the people just as much as the Republican Party has been. And, it creates the situation where the only thing you can do is create these kind of community organizations to push back and fight back. But as long as the interests of capital have their control over these politicians, right, you can make a lot of noise. They're still going to try to push this through anyway. Who knows what will happen in the coming weeks with this? I know people are very adamant that this fight is not over. But it's an extremely negative chapter, along with the fact, as I'm sure you're about to go into, with the real suppression of public dissent that we've seen in the state of Georgia on this issue particularly.
Exactly, that sort of thing from the official Democrats or Democratic electeds. Basically to go from kente cloth during the George Floyd protests to now minor throat clearing about civil rights. As three folks, Marlon Scott Couts, 39, Adele McLean, 42, both from Atlanta, and Savannah Patterson, 30, arrested, charged with money laundering and charity fraud for a bail fund related to this. And that's how these movements, which we idealize in many ways now, the 70s resistance movements, that's how those were hamstrung.
Yeah. And look, it's a dark chapter here. We have, like, in March, a judge charged 22 people with domestic terrorism. Just last week, 3 Atlanta activists were arrested for because they ran a fund that's bailing out protesters. The state attorney general of Georgia has been trying to throw the book at people in ways that even, like, the generally reactionary judiciary has said are laughable.
Right.
In similar ways as what we see here in Texas too, where, like, when these Republicans want to sort of make a national or state name for themselves, they try to utilize state power in the most absurd and aggressive and nasty ways possible. So it's nice when they aren't able to fully utilize them. But again, it just shows, it's complete state.
You don't want that dance.
Like, anti-people,
You don't want that dance between, like, judges who are absolute mutants themselves being reasonable as the fascist Republicans twirl around. Like, yeah, it's not going to be good.
So we'll keep our eye on that, but that's the update on Cop City. We're going to bring on in just one second Alex Hochuli. Alex, thank you so much, friend, for joining us on Left Reckoning.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me to be here.
Yeah, really stoked that you're joining us. For people who don't know Alex, and you should, you can read Alex's work in many different publications, including Damage and Sublation. You can also read the book that he co-authored, The End of History, and listen at BungaCast, which is one of my personal favorite podcasts to listen to. Well, there's a lot I want to get to, and I know this is going to be kind of broad conversation, but I've really been loving a lot of the stuff that you've been putting out, and I like the way that you sort of frame, like, contemporary political moments in, like, the grander scheme of history, and, like, the question of, like, populism and, like, what kind of political movements are we seeing arise. Something that's very important to me, not only because I'm living in this time, but, like, these questions. We lived through this moment, like, with Bernie and Corbyn, where it felt like politics had sort of re-entered society, right? I'm not that old, but, like, I became a lefty, like, in the early, like, Obama years, and I remember just sort of being like, oh, I'm gonna be like, like, this is like my personal secret, right? Like, I think capitalism is bad, but, like, there's no avenue for politics, right? It's like my little secret that I tell people when I've had too many drinks, right? And it felt like there was this really big break with, like, the neoliberal consensus, and after, like, multiple attempts, really exciting ones, but multiple attempts, both Bernie and Corbyn were defeated. And I was just wondering, maybe to start us off, like, how would you sort of describe and think about this form of left populism that we sort of all experienced, and what were some of its downfalls and promises that you felt are sort of interesting for somebody taking that wider lens, thinking historically?
Yeah, word short. I think the further we get from it, the more we can conclude that it was a pretty time delimited experience. It didn't last, right? I mean, we're talking about from 2015 to 2019, and if we want to look across, taking North America and Western Europe in one, and not Europe as a whole, we can date it from maybe the kind of 2013, a little kind of movement of the squares in Southern Europe and things that were bubbling up. In certain countries, this left populist moment led to new political parties, which was the case in Spain with Podemos, for example, as in Greece, in the France Insoumise, France, and then in other countries, it was led to kind of capture an existing left center-left party. I don't even know if you can call the Democrat, or, you know, party in the case of the U.S. Democrats, by basically making a swift grab for the executive. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. I think, like, that is not the process of a slow build of an organization from a local level, or even a kind of immediately at a national, seeking to represent a determinate, like, based on kind of unions, for example, which is how left had been built for, you know, for more than a century. It would have, like, okay, these activists who were able to speak to a broader range of society, but without being quite specific about it, generally young, generally kind of middle class or downwardly mobile middle class. Some sections of that varied according to which country you're talking about, and basically say, hey, we're going to take charge of this party, particularly in the US and the British cases, and try to make a claim for the executive, right? Even if you think about it, actually in the US, it's very literally that, because it's just running through the prime, a huge amount of energy channeled into the Bernie campaign, and not really to kind of claim the legislature, right? Which is often how these, I mean, certainly more parliament, that's how it usually goes. You know, you get one person into parliament, or, you know, locally into local, you know, state legislatures, and then into federal Congress, and then you start building. No, it was like, no, we're gonna seize the presidency, right? Serious limitations as a strategy, but it was one of these kind of opportunistic, the kind of opportunity presented itself both in Britain and the UK, you know, with Corbyn also. So it was a little bit like a joke that suddenly became real, right? That's what basically happened. They put Corbyn up as like, let's pretend that there's like some diversity of ideological and political. Let's put this guy up, and then people went, hang on, no, I'm pissed off. I want something different. This guy's better. Let's vote for him. And, you know, and it snowballed from there. So, you know, it's this kind of perplexed situation of this void where a lot of the kind of capillarity of politics should be, you know, the kind of building blocks of a political party normally are, and it just being like, sees executive power. And what are we going to do with it? Well, good stuff will happen. We don't exactly know yet, you know. And that, I think, captures to a certain extent a lot of the contradictions of that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I want to take a little time on this because, like, this party question I think is really important, particularly in the U.S. Like, we don't, like, a lot of Americans, like, we just don't grow up thinking about parties in, like, maybe like a more Marxist way, right? Because, like, the party is just sort of like whatever letters next to your name is a loose affiliation. You know, you're not really, like, even a member of the Democratic Party isn't really a member of the Democratic Party per se. You know, but one thing that was I'm just curious what you think about this is, you know, somebody looking from the outside in. Like, one thing that was always sort of, I talk about this a lot on the shows, like Bernie, like, had the slogan, like, not me, us, right? But he really developed that in a certain way, saying, like, if I come into power, like, I'm going to need, like, a movement behind me, because, like, I'm going to have to come against the state. And I think it really fell on deaf ears, because a lot of people were like, oh, that means he's thinking about, like, me, you know, he cares about us as voters.
Right.
You know, and it's also
Yeah,
like,
it's
but
like
also,
but it's like when a sports team is like, hey, we couldn't have done that with you in the crowd right there. It's like, that's not really what it's saying.
you know, you're the 12th
Yeah,
man,
and it plays,
right?
you know, and when it's sports, you're like, yeah, that I'm definitely, because you're going, no, come on, like, you know, ushering the ball into the net, or
Yeah.
But the thing is with
with
Bernie too,
politics
it's like,
too absurd.
no, but I mean, like, I'm setting you up. I just want to say, like, the thing with Bernie too is, like, I don't want to let him off the hook too much, because, like, yeah, he made that rhetorical point every once in a while, but, like, structurally, the closest thing he did was create Our Revolution, which I don't even know if you're familiar with it, but, like, it was effectively like a political action committee. It wasn't an organization in any kind of real socialist or, like, Marxist, right? So, like, now Bernie's not running for president anymore, and the entirety of that movement is, like, lost because, like, their head's been chopped off effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most damning thing about the whole left populist was that it didn't lead to anything organizationally, you know, and perhaps it's naive to have expected Bernie to have gone, you know what, screw it, I'm running as an independent, you know, when he didn't get that was in 2016 or in 2020. I suspect by 2020 it was already too late, but yeah, you know, I'm sure you will. But you know, regardless at what point it would have been, and or even if you had the fact that the nomination had been lost, but to at least spin off the not just support and grassroots organization and all the rest into its own party, a better platform to then fight future, elections and build a real politics, not just elections, but build a kind of real political party out of that basis. And so maybe it's naive to expect that Bernie would have done still the most disappointing aspect, because that's really where you can tell that the whole thing goes up in flames really, really quickly. And it's like a piece of paper that you were holding on to, which, ticket, right? A golden ticket that you're holding on, and like this, get it supremacy, and then the country's going to change and everything's going to be better, blah, 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 blah. And it blows up, and it's like, and that's the I think that's probably the cause of a lot of the demoralization you see, I think, in the US, from what we were talking about just before I came on. And I hear about kind of what's going on in Britain, which I've more connections to as well. So that's the thing, how quickly the whole thing blows up. And I think that tells you a lot also about populism in the 21st century, which is, it's a head without a body, or organs. It's like various different kind of metaphors have been used, like, or a locomotive without a train or whatever, right? Like there's just something very, really at the heart of the thing.
Well, I mean, like, I'm curious, if you could help us like flesh this out a little bit, because one of the things that is sort of interesting me about like left populism, if you want to call it that, and like that's another thing too, is like it's very like diffuse. It's like a theory, right? Like there's like Moof and Leclaw wrote their big book on it, but like other than like Podemos, I don't know how much people, like Bernie's not reading Hegemony and Social Strategy or anything like that, I don't think. But like there was something really interesting about that moment, tragic in a lot of ways too, right? Is that like it's not like, you can talk a lot about the Bernie campaign, you could talk about the Corbyn movement, but the fact is, it's like this is across like North America, this is across like Europe. Like there was all these explosions of like this kind of new entry into politics, and all of them sort of lose. I mean, Syriza being the one, I think, that sort of felt like, oh, something's shifting. And then, of course, as everyone knows, they bow down to the European Union and implement like harsh austerity, and have not been able to recover since then. I mean, like, like without even, I mean, you can use any kind of examples that you want, but like, what was it, do you think, about this political movement? Was it just that like party politics and like socialist politics had been so decrepit during the neoliberal era that like these were just some attempts to try to like shake some change into the systems? Is it like, oh, that was a fair shot, but just structurally it could never have worked? Or do you think that there were just fundamental strategic failures that led to all of these things not sort of panning out in the way that it was promised?
Yeah, I mean, it's close to it, you tend to emphasize the contingent. And the further away you get, the more you emphasize the structural, right? And I mean, it's it's somewhere in between. That is just you have to hold to account for their massive, right? I mean, they Greek people, they had it handed. They had the not that situation was easy, but the direction was handed to them on a plate, because 61% rejected the memorandum there, and where it's like, well, that's just pointing in the right direction, just do that. And this is a point where leadership becomes important, right? We'll say, okay, so we're going to reject the memorandum. This is very different, very rocky road, but there's a future if we do X, Y, and Z, right? That's the nature of political leadership. They kind of ran away from it, and so like there, you would emphasize the kind of the kind of effective kind of personalities and their failure to resumption to broach any rupture. But then you start looking, and it kind of looks the same in other places. You go to the UK, okay, well, with Corbyn, well, not guaranteed that if he had supported and been full-throated in defense of seeing through the referendum, that he would have won, party would have won a majority in 2019. That's not guaranteed, but made the project, it might have ripped the Labour Party apart, right? That's also, but actually that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, all right? Because I think a lot of people in the Labour Party did not realize, a lot of Corbyn did not realize, that the people they were facing up against in the party were not a difference of opinion who could be won over. They were the class enemy, or should have been, and they didn't. So that's a party which probably should be ripped apart, and again, unwillingness to broach rupture EU, even though, again, the referendum had been, they're democratic, right? They're Democrats, presume, not U.S. Democrats. They're democratic people. They believe in democracy. They voted. There was a referendum. They voted one way. See it through. It's it's not that hard. People are already pointing you in the right direction. You just need to kind of through an exercise political leadership. And then again, they don't really do it. And then what happens in the again, I already mentioned that even 2016 and even post 2020, there was no attempt to channel all the energy, the kind of stuff that had been built up in terms of actual infrastructure, to the extent that there was a kind of social infrastructure around, into a new party. So again, I think maybe you start looking at it and going, okay, but maybe there is a thread of consistent kind of failures, and it's an unwilling rupture with institutions, whether it's the EU or existing parties, and it's that if you want an omelet without breaking eggs, that's not a good start for your social breakfast.
Well, I'm curious what you think about this, because there's a point that Leo Panich made a lot on Syriza. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was that the argument is obvious, I think, to most socialists, maybe not so much today, because there's this weird EU fetishism, I think, with a lot of US socialists. I think have no conception of good old left Euroscepticism stuff. But Leo Panich would make this argument that yes, 100% it's the wrong decision to sell out the people when they say not to accept this deal, but to really be able to do that, you would have had to been prepared to take on the EU, maybe leave the EU. And what does that mean? I mean, that means economic disaster. Did Syriza have the embeddedness with the people, with the institutions within Syriza, to be able to, for example, make it through a rupture like that? And he basically says no, that work wasn't done before. The connection to the people is really limited. And in this Syrizan context, obviously, it's that so much of the party then had to fill seats. So many of the activists and the locals, they go into government basically, and there's no more connection. But I'm curious if you think that that lack of development, and you could say the same thing about Bernie, Corbyn to a certain extent as well, that ability to be prepared, to rupture. I think that there's 100% it's correct that there was a fear of rupture. Bernie, very clear. Corbyn too. Syriza, absolutely. But this other question of structurally, there was, this lack of development really to be able to do that confrontation that was probably necessary to prevent these things from sort of falling on their face.
Right. I mean, I get that line of argument, and I'm familiar with the Leo Panich used to make. I just think that there's a fundamental political difficulty there in seeing sometimes the opportunity just lands fast, right? And it's can't choose those conditions. I mean, shade, but you would say that 1917 in Russia was not the best place to social revolution, political revolution. Perhaps possibly to try to implement some democracy, but that was unstable. So that revolution had to be seen through at that moment, in the hope that it would unlock the context. And the Greece case might have been one as well. So there's people who argue that if Greece would have been had they reject the memoranda, and then the troika been basically gone, okay, well, see you later, right? I'm not sure that would have been the case. I think they would have conceded on a lot of the demands, and another battle fought. But in any case, taking that 2015 moment and assuming that Greece would have left the Union, and certainly the Euro, most likely both, the economic. Have you seen what has happened to Greece? I mean, that is economic devastation of a of a type hardly outside of wartime. So it's they've had their devastation, but without any future, without any horizon of national autonomy, of trying to build something, and without a context which might be supportive to that. Would that have gone horribly wrong? Quite possibly, but it might have also stimulated other movements for the breakup of the European Union, for countries to try control of their own future and not be hostage to kind of the neoliberal EU in perpetuity. So it's not it's ridiculous to try to depict a kind of rosy picture. If you would have followed my option, everything would have been great. No, Like these are not like rarely, I guess, in history do you get kind of nice rosy options. You only get it just like looking back because things along the way for the majority of people. But at the moment you have to recognize they're not the choices that you would choose.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And so in a second, I want to talk a little bit about, um, your reaction to some of the new figures of power, Starmer leading the Labor Party bot in the U.S. But before we get there, if you don't mind indulging me a little bit, I think a lot of the American audience, and a lot of my UK comrades too, like I don't think people realize how significant of a disaster that like Brexit was, in particular, like the Labour Party's kind of incoherent position on Brexit, the willingness to sort of choose a certain demographic of voters over like maybe a more traditional like Labour voter when it comes to Brexit. I mean, like this could be a whole episode, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but like, if you could just sort of help people who just don't because a lot of Americans, they just think Brexit is like Trumpism, right? Brexit is just like the desire of the far right. And they didn't understand why this was even like a debate for maybe the left to be happening. But if you could just give people like a general sense of like why that was such a disastrous moment for the Labour Party to sort of turn their backs on Labour people who might have supported, Brexit, for example.
Yeah. I mean, so the idea that Brexit was just a bunch of racist immigration is nonsense. Were there elements amongst the Brexit voting base who hold kind of those views or whatever? Sure, yeah, but the issue it was motivated by was a lack of a sense of control, and the kind of genius of Brexit sides and particularly the Tories in creating that slogan, "Taking control, take back control," is that it really speaks to something quite intuitive, which is a sense of control, a sense of alienation, a lack of being unable to the direction of politics in any way. And I think that's kind of shared kind of quite broadly amongst people on all sides of the political spectrum. I mean, amongst the masses more generally, right? That lack of sense of and the idea that Brexit in and of itself, once you leave the EU, that things will then be rosy is wrong, and that's why my colleagues in the UK who've been kind of militating on this front have always kind of tried to push forward the argument that you need to Brexit as a process of democratizing the country, but it's a necessary first step. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And the issue is that yes, perhaps not every voter had the kind of clearest idea of what the EU was, though that itself is, I think, emblematic of the fact that incredibly opaque institution. Where the right wing gets it wrong is that they try to portray Brussels and the EU as this huge domineering bureaucracy that puts the nation state in chains. That isn't the case. Instead, it is a union of elites from all different countries to get together and make decisions behind the backs of their own electorates. Right? We find it on the left, we find it abhorrent that, for example, this between politicians and CEOs behind closed doors about the way regulatory matters will be resolved or whatever, or labor disputes even more so, right? That's abhorrent, right? We're outraged by it. And yet when it happens institutional level with a discourse and this whole layering of talks about cosmopolitanism and friendship and openness and diversity and free movement and whatever, then we're like, oh yeah, we go on and go, yeah, that's true, that is pretty good stuff. Yeah, you're being screwed in the same way, but with a little bit of frost on the top, and it's that doesn't make it any better. And I think the fact that you've already alluded to the fact that there's a long tradition of left Euroscepticism, which a lot of people on the left in Britain tried to forget or just kind of go, well, that's old stuff, that's not relevant anymore, because about diversity and therefore we need to be in the EU. I mean, just obfuscatory, really complicit. An attempt ultimately to keep us in the end of history, to keep us in a moment of try to clamp down on these outbursts of politics, which are not necessarily, again, the way that we would dream things to look, because we imagine it to come through with waving a red flag and whatever. No, it doesn't emerge like that. But if you would have asked asked me, and I think a lot of other people as well, in 12 or whatever, kind of late Obama years we were talking about before I came on, what would you want? And you'd say, well, I'd want a return of politics. You want a kind of clash of as a starting point for then developing a kind of socialist politics, and to have kind of politics back in a certain ugly, and it's messy and it's completely insane, and we can get onto that to the nature of that insanity. But it's still nevertheless a kind of better place to be in than a situation where everything is consensus, everything is kind of there's the appearance of consent. There's no kind of possibility for political debate or contestation or different sides, and even taking it side is seen as completely pathological. We've moved beyond. I think that's a few tiny little bits of progress or things to be optimistic about.
Well, here's the kind of challenge I'll lay at you right now, Alex, because I definitely think politics have changed fundamentally, but there's this kind of I think in the U.S. in particular, we have this Bernie moment, we have Trump. There's some kind of grand irony that the person who ends up taking power at the end of that is Joe Biden, who's literally just a sleepwalk from the 1970s. When he comes into office, there are all these grand claims. That politics have changed, and Biden is going to usher in the argument here. I don't know if you saw it too much, but Biden is going to be this reluctant FDR. He might not like it, but times have changed too much. He's going to have to push for these grand sweeping programs. And just looking at the past few months, I mean, they cut Medicare dramatically. They have work requirements on social programs, student loans. They completely capitulated on that. They're going to push forward more pipelines and things of that nature. That there's a part of me that does feel like politics have shifted pretty dramatically, but there's also this very incredible kind of entrenchment now of that old style of politics. So, do you think that we may be returning? Are we returning maybe back to an end of history? Or do you think that that they're incapable of returning to that, even though they might try to clamor and push things backwards?
Yeah, question. And, I don't think it's exactly return to the end of history, because the specific conjuncture that firstly, a unipolar world, complete American hegemony. So even at the international scene, things have changed and won't go back. And in that regard, I think that has kind of domestic consequences everywhere. The U.S. might not feel it so much immediately because it's big and too important, but again, it will eventually. I mean, there's that of all, and also just the ideological repertoire of clamping down on politics, right? The ideological, the kind of and rhetorical repertoire, right? The ways that try to kind of dampen things, right? Try to kind of keep things quiet, make sure you go about your daily business and whatever, and don't make a fuss, right? Which is kind of the post politics as that repertoire just is credible anymore. I don't think that's something that they can use, right? But what they can use is kind of, I think, one of the ways in which politics is clamped down nowadays is paradoxically form of hyper politicization. So, okay, what does that exactly mean? Well, it means that the kind of culture war of all issues, and where you're a certain type of person, you're whatever middle class professional woman living in, we're going to have X, Y, and Z views, and they're going to be all neatly lined up, and those are the only views you can express. And the same goes for the other side of the spectrum, right? And it's a way of kind of channeling people's angers and frustration, things that take the form of debate, of contestation, of politics, but which are basically intractable and just allow for a lot of shouting to happen. It's narcissistic because it just makes you you feel like you have your go on, and that's the end of that. So I think that is one of the ways in which politics is being kind of subverted in a way, ironically, through the appearance of more politics. Hey, politics is back. We're debating, right? But even things seem political, like the question of immigration, which is a fundamentally political question, and up taking the form of kind of a culture war with kind of extreme positions on their side, which aren't actually representative of what the average American probably or wants. And none of them are actually realistic policies, right? Neither building a wall nor open borders are realistic policies. But that, that then everything just polarizes on those grounds. So I'm not making an argument against polarization, right? But it's like there's a kind of phony polarization, radicalism that goes on, which happens only at the level of kind of ideas, and stupid ideas too. It's not even that they're great ideas, but yeah, so that's what's going on. So Biden kind of comes into this, and what does he represent? I think to a certain extent, the reluctant FDR point recognizes that neoliberalism couldn't continue as it was. Even today, you could say, yeah, we're still in a kind of neoliberal period. Its features would be unrecognizable to an anti-neoliberal in the 1980s, right? Like the vibe is totally different to kind of Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, right? It's not slashing, cutting back. And it's not even the kind of rollout period that was known of the 2000s, where you start creating pseudo markets everywhere. It's kind of this zombie neoliberal thing that's going on, where there's a recognition that there needs to be some sort of industrial policy, if anything, just because of not to say it's because so much comes from kind of financial activities that's kind of fine, but more in terms of the decrepit kind of state of infrastructure services and whatever, and for geopolitical competition reasons, right? And so like the world is pushing kind of politically in a certain direction, but that isn't enough, right? There needs to be some subjective put towards a real break with neoliberalism. So in the end, you get Biden kind of doing something, make sure we're going to subsidize risk for private companies but without the state actually developing any new capacities itself, state-owned enterprises being set up, the state doing anything directly. It's just providing a buffer for private capital. And that, in the end, is like a little bit the kind of most orthodox neoliberalism, but isn't totally different to what, whatever. I know you guys are going to talk about Turkey. Erdogan has been doing in Turkey for the past 20 years. Loads of shit, right? Like Turkey has got new air roads, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you guys will talk this, but that was also kind of a neoliberal government, but just one which was a little bit more focused on building. But so that's kind of where you would place a figure like Biden. I don't know. I'm curious, guys, whether he's going to be a president. Do you think he's going to be an important president? Like term is over.
I'll just say real quick, and I'll let David jump in on that. But I do think that's right to mark that change in the mood towards things like state intervention in the economy, which like when I was growing up, it was like, nope, that's just a free market's job. And then also, I do think we're in a different place where it used to be welfare queen, let's go take money out of those people's mouths. And now it's, oh, we lost that in the budget somewhere. We missed that in the copy machine. We'll feed the people next time. So yeah, I do think there is a marked change in that. Go ahead, David.
No, I think what Alex is saying is right. Like in the general sense, like, look at, I don't know if you know this, but the IRA, which they don't like calling it IRA, by the way, they call it IRA because they don't want to be associated with the IRA. What is it? It's a bunch of tax breaks and credits. It's like we're going to deal with the climate crisis or whatever, but in the most like convoluted, old school, like American way possible. But like, I think that like the way that like politics is sort of being done in the US is like it's very it's very strange. Like, to give an example, like one of the PR stunts that my governor Greg Abbott's doing on the border has been these busing of migrants. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but basically they get people at the border and then they're busing them to sanctuary cities, New York, Chicago. They'll put them in front of Biden's house or Kamala Harris's house, right? And it's all like show, but it's really cruel. I'm being a little flippant here, right? It's like extremely cruel. They're tricking people, but like there's a part of it that like, like in a nice kind of social democratic society, you could imagine like a nice system where like when people come into the country, you meet them at the border and you say like, where do you want to go? Like we will
The
provide
real, like the actual like Nazis, you see him when DeSantis does this stunt, and he's like, this is not a good precedent to be setting.
you know, and like the point is, like, I just want for people to be clear, is like what they do now is they lie to people. They say, like, we're going to send you to a place that has jobs and healthcare for you, and they literally just drop them off at the side of the road. It's really nasty. But like, you know, like there are like parts of politics that I think are like unique even on the right today. But you know, for me, it's just I think that what you saw was like particularly like under COVID, and I think this is like international, is that there was this kind of world historic event, the COVID crisis, and the tools, the institutions that were available to the state were so decrepit and limited they couldn't do anything, right? You could either use the police state, you know, harsh lockdowns, that kind of thing, or you know, the kind of stimulus that went into the economy was literally just like the Federal Reserve, like holding up stock prices, you know, giving loans to major banks. You know, we got like $1,200 once or twice, and that was like a huge deal. But like the state literally, like even if the state, I guess the point is, like even if somebody at the top of the state apparatus was like, I want to do more for people, like the American government doesn't do shit like that. Like it doesn't have that muscle. The thing that it has is like, how can we flow public money into the pockets of private industry?
As an example, we did that with instead of doing Medicare for all, which is hey, maybe we do that, get around to doing that during a massive pandemic that's going to eventually kill 1 million people. We did what was called Cobra, which is a massively subsidized, extremely expensive, way more expensive than actual just single payer would be, just to keep people on private insurance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Zill, go ahead.
No, I'll let you kind of finish your question.
Well, no, I mean, I was hoping to jump around a little bit, because you know, like I was hoping we could talk a little bit about Brazil, because like you know, it's an interesting example where like Lula, you know, somebody who was a very successful president, the PT had a lot of successes, you know, in like finding, like, you know, I mean, I shouldn't load the question up too much, but like, you know, like Lula's an interesting character because like he comes from the radical left. He in office in his first time was like somebody who tried to find a way to make like capital happy generally and still do social programs for the poor, right? Very popular for that reason. Bolsonaro comes in, you know, feels like a huge shift in the country. Now Lula is back in power, and you know, our audience is fairly familiar with Brazil, but like I'm curious like how you would maybe place Lula in this general like historic framework of like the left and politics and history, because I know he's up against a lot, but you know, there's a lot of people here who sort of look, I mean, like I'll just say this. Lula had a campaign pitch that he did that I felt was like designed for me, where he was talking about picanha, you know, like barbecue. And like we've played that clip on the show a lot because it's just like, I think we should do politics like that all the time, saying I think everyone deserves not only the restoration of their rights, but they should have a cold beer and a nice piece of meat on the barbecue on Saturday. Yeah, we have our little picanha cards that
nice
that Bolsonaro sent out, which I don't know, real own goal. But I mean, you know, I'm just curious, you know, how you think that his politics sort of fit into this, because I think like as like a retail politician, Lula can talk about things in a way a lot of other politicians are completely inept. But I'm curious what your feelings are on him so far.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that kind of that charisma and action that he has compensates for a lot, right? I think that's maybe the best way to put it. Lula, the PT period in office from 2003 to 2016 was effective liberalism. I mean, for all that there was, you know, an attempt to characterize it as a new solution for the world, kind of some new model. Ultimately, it was the same end of history sort of politics, the kind of politics that was reigning in West and Western Europe, except it was a more leftish flavor, right? And the conditions for that made that possible, that made that allowable, if you want to put it that way. The reason that the elite kind of did business and kind of more or less to govern and was because there was growth, there was a commodity cycle, and so there was enough to go around, enough pork to distribute, that it meant more or less everyone happy. And within those constraints, then Lula does some redistributors, which are, you know, within the context of Brazil, which is so and so badly governed, which has the worst elite in the world. I've made this point many times before, but I genuinely think there's no as bad, as degenerate, as Philistine elite anywhere in the world. Particularly given the country's kind of natural endowments and possibilities, and how much it's repeatedly fucked over the country, that doing even a little bit goes a long way and went a long way. But it's important to kind of, and to refer back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of populism of a lot of contemporary political movements, is that what actually happened as the got into power, that it hollowed out its own base by demobilizing its activists. A lot of people, kind of trade unionists got placed into managing pensions and stuff like that, so they became bureaucrats, and its base became demobilized. And the way that it interacted its voters was in a pretty kind of what's called assistentialism. It's kind of an ugly word in English. Basically, handouts to people, and inclusion through consumption, as it was called. Inclusion. So it's credit. It's kind of pretty neoliberal, right? Like, it's giving people credit, access to consumer goods. So suddenly they get entry into the kind of marketplace, and able to, working class people, creation effectively of an affluent working class, what in Brazil class, people able to afford a refrigerator, send their kids to university for the first time. All very good social advance, but in a very individualized basis, and also a very fragile, flimsy basis, that as soon as economic is hit, it gets taken away. And that kind of explains a little bit why the PT, not why they got, why the coup happened of 2016, why they got thrown out of office, and to know why there wasn't more resistance to it. And so in that context, you can say, well, okay, so what does Lula represent? A kind of left neoliberal politician, and one who his legacy guaranteed, because he wasn't the one thrown out of office in 2016, and an expectation perhaps that, which he did now at the beginning of that, his political talents will be able to see through a kind of decent government. And ironically, the contribution of Bolsonaro's and Trump's of this world, their primary contribution is to make the most limited, short-term, basic kind of politics seem kind of welcome, because you just want a little bit of normality. You want just to be governed in a decent manner, with less kind of fireworks constantly.
So would you call like
the
kind of, this is like a Biden thing, right? It's like Trump is so crazy, the government doesn't work under him. Now we have Biden, and he can. I'm saying, is it similar to in the US, like
Yeah, so like just the basic competency of government, which like is, generally you're like, no, that's not really politics, right? You're not want to talk. That's the type of stuff that technocrats talk about competence and whatever. Talk about ideology, about ideas, about the working class, about social competence. Ironically, makes pine for a government which just has a certain. Now, where are we? Where are we with Lula? Because now is that Congress, the leader of Congress, a man called Artur Lira, kind of clientelist politician, pork barrel, kind of child for pork barrels. He basically has the Lula government by the balls. It means that its legislative already fairly reduced because of a very hostile Congress, has been reduced even further. And it's going to be very tricky for this government to do anything. Like, this was a government which you'd expect to have a honeymoon period for, the first 6 months, Congress to play nice, whatever. No. And so, there's a certain amount that Lula can do in terms of rolling back all the bad stuff that Bolsonaro did. But that would only take us back to the ante of 2016 or whatever, 18, which was terrible. Right? It's a little bit less terrible. So, I put it at the choice was between disaster in the form of Bolsonaro or terminal decline which would be, okay, you'll choose terminal decline over disaster, but like it's not a lot there to go on. And I'm being kind of gloomy about it, but the reality is that there was no kind of political force on the streets to kind of drive through a different politics. It was the country. Lula won by very little. Bolsonaro still remains popular, and he the support of kind of traditional middle class people who have traditionally voted for the center, voted for Lula just because it was kind of like, well, just want to, Bolsonaro's too crazy. Let's have a little bit of normalcy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is sort of one of the big crises for maybe the more institutional lefts that cross the Americas. Like, not to bog it down or anything, like, AMLO is like another character who, like, we talk a lot about in this program because he's so demonized in America as this crazy dictator that you have to spend so much time being like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, he's, expanding the right to vote and somehow that's anti-democratic. But then you have to be careful to not fall into the trap of making it seem like, AMLO is like, a radical socialist, right? He's like a very skilled populist and like defend him against the right, but like this is not where we have to be in the long term. And maybe one day down the line we could get together and do like a long America's conversation, because I feel like we're running low on time. So I want to ask you before you roll, and I'm sorry to throw this question at you because I'm not good at cheering the audience up, but like we've seen these brief windows of like hope and opportunity and changes. We've seen how they've failed. I mean, should we despair? I mean, what would something that maybe could reinvigorate a different kind of politics for the left, right? Not just changing the conversation, but like maybe winning and doing something different sort of look like to you? And I know that's a hard one to wrestle with, but if you give us a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I just think like from afar, but the Anglo-American left just doomed. I mean, to be so far in terms of its kind of values, even I hate it because it sounds so relativistic, but like its principles just seem to be so far away from what was taken to be orthodox socialist position. Even though it's just take one example, it's complicity or just blitheness in the face of censorship, and the way that a lot of the left has behaved with regard to the FBI and all that kind of stuff. It's just like, this is just basic, and there's a lot of problems with the kind of Gen X left, which was really political, rejecting everything, just one little subculture. But at least it didn't care for the man very much. Like now you have a left, like, kind of likes the man and kind of wants, well, or to put it in kind of your kind of psychoanalytic terms, it just wants mommy, right? It just wants the state to be mom, to come and care for you. Delusional. So I think kind of, yeah, I don't know. I wish I could have kind of a more optimistic note, but to go back to kind of basic liberal principles, and whether that is defend individual liberties or growth as a good thing, or at least certainly a lot less ground to fight on than a situation of degrowth. These basic things, and to turn towards the masses and your fellow citizens as people who can be won over, as potential friends and colleagues, and not as people to be antagonized, to make yourself seem more radical. Actually listen to people and talk to them, and to take their concerns, judge them. I think that would be a good start. Hopefully, at least they, I think the kind of paroxysm has is ebbing. It's kind of, maybe that will push a lot of people away from that, and people try to distance them, kind of return back to some more core left-wing values.
I hope so. The thing, I mean, this is selfish of me, but I also wish that some people would give some folks credit who were challenge these things to much personal abuse. So like our friend Adam Proctor, for example, who just got attacked constantly for making these points a few years ago, and now everyone's reading this Hannah Gadsby takedown piece in the New York Times as if we were all in agreement about this for the past 6 years. It's like, no,
Right.
you guys were brutal for anyone who challenged this kind of thing. Brother, I mean, like, I feel like, you know, there's a lot more I really wish I was able to talk to you about, but we might have to do it another time. Folks, definitely listen to BungaCast if you aren't already. There are links below. Get the book. Alex, brother, really appreciate talking with you and love to do it again sometime soon.
Great. Thank you guys for having me on. Enjoyed it.
Yep.
Take care.
Thanks,
friend.
Alex.
Cheers.
Yeah, that was good. Dude, I'm sorry not to get into it, but like when that Gatsby piece, did you read it? The
I'll be
takedown?
honest. I have avoided any Hannah Gadsby shit for like 4 years now. I don't know what her deal is. I know it's probably not for me,
It's
and
definitely not for you.
I have not engaged zero. So I don't know. I know there was a piece recently, but she has
No,
a
I mean,
new.
well, she just put out this horrible exhibit attacking Picasso
She's
in the
got
Brooklyn Museum.
yeah, she's at the Brooklyn Museum. Yeah, I know.
You could go
Yeah,
see it, Matt.
I will not be doing that.
Anyways, like, and everybody's like taking this big breath of fresh air, like finally somebody's saying something about it. And it's just like, shut the fuck up. People have been saying this for years and they like were dragged through it. But anyways, really great talking with Alex. We're going to bring on the big man himself, Mr. Djene Bajalan, on. Djene, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, guys?
Stoked to have you. It was really great chatting with Alex. Just programmatically, folks, I know everyone's talking about the Cornel West thing. We are going to talk about it in the post game with Djene. We have a lot of thoughts, but before we get to that, we wanted to be responsible and have a little bit of a healthy dinner before dessert, and talk about Turkey. Djene, I mean, you know, we're like this probably around 10 minutes or so. So like we won't be able to go through everything, but this was a pretty significant election. And like we've had you on a few times to talk about Turkey in general. But I was wondering if you could just give people a general sense about this recent election. You know, a lot of people thought that maybe Erdogan's power might be waning, and that's not what ended up happening. You know, could you maybe talk about why people thought that he was weak and
Sure.
why he's still in power?
Sure. So obviously, I mean, I myself personally was very skeptical that the opposition could win this election. There were certain structural reasons for that. You know, people use this term: Turkey has free but not fair elections. I recognize that's a shorthand for something, namely that Turkey does have some integrity at the ballot box, but the circumstances in which elections take place are, to put it mildly, problematic when you have opposition politicians being prosecuted by the state, when you have a formal and informal dominance of the ruling party over the apparatus of the media, and the ability of the ruling party to use the apparatus of the state to support its electoral campaigns. So this obviously was not a quote unquote free or fair election. But, you know, Erdogan had suffered some setbacks in the past. He'd lost the mayoral races in Ankara and Istanbul. Well, his party had lost them anyway. But, you know, as the election sort of came closer, it seemed that the economic problems in the country, that the, you know, just the general fatigue of certain elements of society with the Erdogan administration, that, you know, that there might be a shot for the opposition. And again, I was very skeptical about this because, you know, my question was always, well, you know, are they really going to give up power after 20 years? And also, the AKP maintains a significant proportion of the population. It has all these informal networks to support its members. It's a huge political party. And it is in Turkey, in many ways, the only national party. And what I mean by that, it's the only party that really has an organizational strength across the entirety of the country. Obviously, there are places where it's weaker, places where it's stronger. But, you know, if you look at the electoral map of Turkey, you'll see that the opposition does better in different areas. You know, pro-Kurdish political parties do better in the Kurdish areas. the main opposition, the Republican People's Party, the CHP, as it's known in its Turkish acronym, that does well in urban centers and in Western Anatolia. Nationalists do well in certain parts of Inner Anatolia. But, there was a sense, especially as some of the polling came out, and, I was very skeptical about the polling as well. But, there were smart people who were like, actually, maybe the opposition has a shot. They seemed to have, you had this table of 6, which, included former Erdogan people. It included far-right nationalists who were angry at the far-right nationalists who were with Erdogan. You had a bunch of other smaller political parties, and you had the Kurdish political parties.
Well, I was going to say notably absent from the table of 6, the opposition is Kurdish people, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Kurdish political parties were informally in an electoral alliance because, you had far-right, elements. Basically, you had this far-right party called the E Party, which was a split from the MHP, which is the nationalist party that's in alliance with Erdogan. Obviously they and their supporters aren't going to support Kurds, so it's a very difficult opposition to bring together because you have an entire gamut of political opinion. There's no unifying ideology behind them except opposition to Erdogan. And so, I was skeptical. I think my skepticism was proven correct. And the opposition lost in the first round, but Erdogan didn't get them the 50 plus that he needed, so it went to a second round. And basically, Erdogan romped them, crushed them. There was a resounding victory for the Erdogan administration that remains in power. And of course, this year is very symbolic for them. There was so much symbolism in this election. For example, May 14th was the day that the first multi-party elections were held in Turkey. This is also the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne and the establishment of the Turkish Republic. This is like the 600th anniversary of the conquest of Istanbul. It's like just pouring in the symbolism for that. So this was a resounding victory for for Erdogan, partly because of the unfair advantage that he has in this political system in Turkey, but also because there is no real coherent opposition to Erdogan. The table of 6 did not have a particularly coherent or even attractive policy. So, for example, Turkey is suffering from serious inflation at the moment and also serious unemployment. Now, the technocratic arguments coming from the opposition was like, well, we're going to have a sensible economic policy, which means raising interest rates. And as we all know, what do you think raising interest rates is going to mean? It's going to mean chucking loads of people out of work. It means, capitulating to international finance capital. Now, so, the opposition, Turkey's in a profound economic crisis that it really can't resolve by itself. It's part of a global economic crisis. And, Turkey's ability to deal with that. So, people went with the devil they knew. I think, there is a significant opposition proportion that is now more and more motivated to be hostile to Erdogan. There's greater polarization in the country. But you have 5-6 million people in the middle who can be persuaded. And I think people went with the safe pairs of hands. And despite the economic crisis that Turkey is visited upon Turkey at the moment, people also have to remember that, the AKP presided over a significant expansion of Turkish infrastructure. And, if you were living in a shantytown in the 90s, you're living in an apartment today. So yes, there's short-term economic crisis, but you're grateful to the administration that, provided you with running water, a warm house, things to do, respect.
I mean, I think that I obviously know way less than you do about Turkey, but I think that this is something that's really important to recognize about Erdogan is that they're just there is this general sense of gratitude from what is effectively just I don't know, like state developmentalist politics, right?
Yeah, I mean, the AKP came into power at a time of crisis. There'd been a huge economic crisis. There'd been an earthquake in Turkey. The 90s in general had been a kind of lost decade where you had very weak governments. You had the removal of a government by the military. You had the intensification of the war with the PKK. You had, it was a dark time, and it was capped off with this like inflation crisis, economic crisis in Turkey. And, you had this technocrat, Kemal Dervish, who did some very painful reforms for Turkey, but it did set up Turkey for a bounce back, a kind of economic bounce back. We're always dogging on neoliberalism, but, for a country like Turkey, neoliberalism provided it with an opportunity, right? It was an opportunity. There was enormous amounts of privatization that took place that led to hot money coming in the country, but also, in countries with large welfare states, neoliberalism means cutting the welfare state. Now, in Turkey, there was a kind of quasi-welfarism with like cheap credit being, and I'm not an expert on this, Cihan Turgil has written about this, but, using housing policy to ensure people could get houses, adopting policies that benefited people, providing the extreme poor with, coal and, other necessities of life. And also the AKP's networks that used to distribute things as well. So the AKP were fortuitous in that, after a contraction, they were able to, during the 2000s, benefit. They got the credit for being in office when you had this boom in the Turkish economy. And they were able to delay the impact, kick the impact of the 2008 economic crisis down the road. Although, obviously, eventually you do have to pay the piper, and they're paying the piper right now. So, the AKP, for many people, is their political party. And we often talk, people talk about things like nationalism, economics, religion, all as separate issues, but they're all very much related to each other. I mean, obviously, it makes sense in an organizational sense to, divide those things up as distinct factors in an election, but they are in reality linked to each other. And, Erdogan was seen as a kind of champion of the people. And for the first decade of the AKP's rule, you had the AKP being challenged by an opposition that basically realized they couldn't win any elections, so kept appealing to the refs, the Constitutional Court, things like that, to have the AKP shut down, etc., etc. Now, obviously, there was a kind of liberal golden age during this period. But, after the Gezi protests, after growing economic problems, there was a kind of authoritarian turn. And Erdogan is a political opportunist. And I don't say that in a normative sense, but he's a very shrewd political operator. And he was able to change with the political winds. So especially after 2015, where, Erdogan's political party lost its majority in the parliament, he rejiggered his base of power, brought in nationalists who he'd previously persecuted, dumped the kind of liberal and Kurdish allies that he'd had early during his administration, and reorientated the kind of, to use a Gramscian term, the historic bloc. But at the core of that bloc are the same people. You have this, let's say, conservative urban populations in central Anatolia, and of course this Anatolian capitalist middle class, which had got rich in the 80s under neoliberalism, but got heck of a lot richer under Erdogan as well. So this core remained in place, and Erdogan has kind of kept things going by maintaining an alliance with the far right, the MHP. And, this was borne out in the parliamentary elections. While everybody was focusing on the presidential election, there were parliamentary elections, which were, again, Erdogan and his coalition partners were able to get a majority in the parliament. And so he's in a strong position, and the opposition really did not have a coherent program of, and this is when facing these authoritarian leaders around the world, the problem is very often there is no coherent opposition. As I said, with the opposition coalition that coalesced behind Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, you had left-wing Kurds, everything from left-wing Kurds to out-and-out grey wolf Turkish fascists. And that's not a sustainable political alliance. And Erdogan was able to play on that. He was able to, bring in the support of conservative Kurdish elements into his coalition. He brought in a political party that was associated with the Turkish Hezbollah, which was an Islamist organization which had its base in the Kurdish population and had fought a vicious war with the PKK in the 90s, brought those into his political coalition, and so was able to say that he represents the dominant majority of Turkish society. On one hand, he was able to portray himself as being, portray the opposition as being, on one hand, in cahoots with American imperialism, while at the same time, he was able to present himself as a more moderate person on nationalism, in that he was not pursuing such a hardline approach to the Syrian refugee question, which many nationalists in the opposition were angry about, because you have this kind of powerful Turkish nationalism. And, if you want to think about it on a theoretical sense, Erdogan really is this archetypical Bonapartist ruler. He's able to, at first, bring the political party that he had under his control and basically dominate the apparatus of the state and use democracy and populist issues to polarize society, whether that's the culture wars that he brings in. You had all these things about turning Hagia Sophia into a mosque, changing the name of the country to Turkey, these kind of like symbolic issues, and also the wars that Erdogan became involved in. When we think of imperialism, we often think of it as synonymous with colonialism. But, if you go back to Marx's understanding of imperialism, he looks at it as almost synonymous with the idea of Bonapartism, in the way that war is used to consolidate regimes at home. And of course, the war in Syria didn't really have that much of an economic motivation for Erdogan. And even the security concerns, well, Erdogan had been in negotiations with the PKK, but when, the Kurdish political parties didn't support his, attempt to create an executive presidency, he dumped them and the war was restarted. And if you ask me, it was deliberately restarted, in order to provide this kind of polarization. So the Syrian war and then the war in Azerbaijan became this way to split the opposition, hive off the radical left that had coalesced around the pro-Kurdish political parties from the more mainstream political parties, opposition political parties, the CHP and the E Party, which under the conditions of war, rally behind the government. So constantly he's keeping the opposition off balance with this protean vocabulary, this appeals to populism. And, the CHP's platform, Kılıçdaroğlu's platform, was a return to Turkey being a normal country. But, what does that mean, right? What does that mean to people? This dream of a restoration. The conditions that existed in the 2000s for this kind of liberal period of the occupation, they don't exist anymore. And so this dream of a restoration didn't work. And I think, people got ahead of themselves when there was some favorable polling that came out. And there was this big idea that, Kılıçdaroğlu's going to win. And so the discussion started coming, will Erdogan give up office? Which was a moot point because he was able to win the election. And, the few percentage points that he won by, are quite significant. right? So he maintained his base, and the opposition didn't do themselves any favors. The opposition, after the first round, basically in desperation, there'd been a couple of third-party candidates, which I suppose we're going to be discussing third parties
in a second. Yeah.
Hard right candidates in the hard right section of Turkish politics, the grey wolf wing of Turkish politics. The leader of the MHP, Devlet Bahçeli, he's kind of old, and there's a lot of people trying to position themselves as the new voice of the new voice. And you had this guy Sinan Oğan, who was kind of positioning himself in this run. You have the Meral Akşener, who's the E-Party person, positioning herself in that way. So basically, the opposition just ran hard to the right, attacking Kurds, many of whom had delivered a very high vote for Kılıçdaroğlu in the first round, and also going hard on the Syrian refugees. And that just wasn't a way. Why vote for these nationalists when you can vote for those nationalists, right?
Yeah.
And the ones that are in power, and you know what you're doing with them. And so basically they kind of just, as we say, defecated in the bed and lost. Now, and this loss has kind of exposed the problems with the opposition. Kılıçdaroğlu has been leader of CHP for I believe 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of falling on his sword after this defeat, he's just moving to tighten his control of the party. And so the opposition in Turkey is really a basket case. And I don't think they have, any real program for addressing the problems in the country, because they themselves have a kind of anti-democratic impulse to them.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be the case from what you're saying. Also, the piece that's in the New Left Review. I mean, the idea that you're going to be delivered the end of Erdogan, from God or fate or whatever, doesn't seem to be the case. Djene, it's always a pleasure talking with you. You're going to be hanging out with us for a little bit longer to talk in the post game about this new West campaign, another third party movement. Hear your thoughts. People get to access that patreon.com/left reckoning. But before we go, I mean, you got a new project that would be great if you could plug for folks.
Oh yeah, well, I have a new radio show on KSMU, which is our local NPR affiliate. It's called Talking History. We talk with academics, about historians, about history, and a lot of different stuff. I co-host it with Patrick Needham, who is formerly of the Hoot and Holler podcast. Hoot and Holler is now disbanded, so Patrick is now doing this radio show once a month with me. But you don't have to be in Missouri to listen to it. It's released as a podcast, currently available, I believe, on Spotify as well as on the KSMU website, but soon to be on other podcast platforms. We've had 2 episodes so far. We had Jeremy Neely, who is a historian of the Civil War. He's written on the Civil War in Missouri, a lot of stuff about the border states, and he's written a new book on the way that the Civil War transformed the lives of people on the home front. He has a case study of a homemaker whose husband went away to war, and how the war, turned her into a kind of political being. That was our first episode. And our second episode was with Dr. Sarah Mallers, who's written a really fascinating book on the history of birth control in China and eugenics, good eugenics and bad eugenics, because eugenics is just birth control. And so she's talked about, we talked specifically about the one-child policy, which is part of her book on birth control in China. But we talk more generally about, the relationship between eugenics and the birth control movement, what this meant, how the Chinese Republic approached it, how the People's Republic approached it, which was like a fascinating episode. So this are our first 2 episodes. Hopefully we'll be having some more exciting episodes covering everything from ancient Egypt to the Spanish Inquisition in Missouri. you may not know this, but there was actually a Spanish Inquisition in Missouri, which people don't know about.
Oh shit!
They had in Texas, Missouri. Yeah.
Briefly a Spanish territory.
Yeah, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but St. Louis, baby, they had some auto de fe there. So, you know, we'll be talking about that with John Chuchek. We'll be talking about possibly with Spencer Leonard. We'll be talking about Marx's writings on the American Civil War. So we have a bunch of stuff lined up.
Well, definitely be checking that out, folks. Djene's
good for those Missouri NPR listeners. That's great stuff, and I like.
Yeah, no, I'm stoked that you're on the radio waves there.
I like playing it straight with the talking history too. It's not like Djene's commie hour, just like nice talking history.
Well, yeah, we're not doing just we're not doing just commie stuff.
Of course,
yeah. I wanted
to
do
you're there.
But yeah, we're doing something. It's something I wanted to bridge between doing something like podcasts and something academic, because I think there's a lot of different. Well, one of the problems I have on the left is that I think you can learn a lot from good liberal and even conservative historians, and I think there is a kind of desire to just like ignore people who don't align with our politics. And I wanted to pursue something more academic, where we could talk to academics who have done actual real research in topics, and just do a kind of focused historical interview to talk about their work, things that they teach, and those kind of things. Because I think ideological media is fine, but I think sometimes I don't like the paradigm of activist scholar. I mean, you can be an activist and a scholar, but I feel like things start to go wrong when you too much combine those two roles.
Yeah, I agree. There's people who act like everything with an academic university press imprint is CIA, and I just think like you need to have and understand that actually that's our terrain. Like we can go into like that history and completely own it in a way that even like a conservative historian or a liberal historian writing it might not understand. So yeah, I completely agree with that outlook.
Well, folks, we're going to run over to the post game, patreon.com/left reckoning. Djene will be joining us. We're going to be talking a little bit about Cornel West, maybe a left revival in Chick-fil-A, and taking your calls and questions. Be sure to join us. Programmatically, sorry, I know for people watching on YouTube, there were some audio issues with Alex, but we got all of that like crystal clear here. So just know.
So yeah, I'm unclear.
Version, YouTube version in the future, all that will be very clear, because our recordings are good. YouTube, we had an issue.
Well, I have a local recording here that I started 10 minutes into it. I will check on how Restream's recording. I don't trust Restream, so at the very least, everything after the first 10 minutes will be clean audio, and we'll talk about Restream, replacing Restream.
Well, yeah, we might need to. Well, friends, we'll be over at patreon.com/left reckoning post game with Djene Bajalan, about 10 minutes. So join us over there. And thanks everyone so much.
Peace.